this something? This is a 400-year-old nose. It's a botched nose job, and it shows how little our feelings about transplants have changed. Look at that. Wow. I wonder why they had to have that on their nose. This is on The Conversation by Alana Skews, lecturer in English Literature, University of Reading, in the UK. In 1624, a physician called Jean-Baptiste van Helmont told a strange story in his book of Magnetic Cures about a man from Brussels who had lost his nose. Having had his nose cut off in combat, the man went to a famous Italian surgeon, Gaspare Tagliacozzi, who promised to make him a new one, resembling nature's pattern. The problem was that Tagliacozzi wanted to use some of the man's own skin to recreate the nose. Not keen on this idea, the noseless man decided to buy his way to a new face. He hired a local porter to donate some of his skin and had the surgeon fashion a new nose out of the foreign tissue. All seemed well, recounted Van Helmont, until just over a year later, the man found that his new nose suddenly grew frigid and cadaverous, and over the next few days it began to putrefy on his face, and within a week it had dropped off entirely. Kindly support my Patreon account since YouTube has again demonetized my YouTube channel. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below. So the nose dropped off entirely within a week. Investigating the cause of the sudden misfortune, the man's friend found out that the porter who supplied the flesh had died at just the same time that the nose first turned cold. Now, this is not a joke. This is actually what happened. Though Van Helmont admitted that the story seemed fantastical, he insisted that there were men of good repute that were eyewitnesses of these occurrences. And this, he insisted, was not superstition, but evidence of a powerful affinity between the borrowed tissue and its original owner. I guess the tissue just putrefied, they believe, because the owner passed away. I mean, maybe it's because it had no blood circulating in it, or it was not even compatible tissue to the person that it was grafted on. Now, it says here, when I read Helmont's extraordinary story, almost 4 centuries later, it led me down a rabbit hole of 17th century medical and philosophical writings, and eventually to writing a book on early modern surgery and embodiment. In the process, it emerged that the phenomenon Van Helmont described was based on philosophical and scientific speculation about the existence of a sympathetic connection between disembodied flesh and its original owner. This in turn reflected deep-seated belief in the importance of one's body to identity, which led to anxious debates about the resurrection of the body after death. I also found that, though the concerns of Renaissance patients and physicians about borrowed flesh, quote-unquote, might seem outlandish and out of date, they are surprisingly relevant to the modern surgical landscape. Both commonplace cosmetic surgeries and more radical procedures such as hand and face transplants center on the belief that how we look is a central part of our identity, at the same time that they offer us a chance to be our real selves by changing our appearance. Like the early rhinoplasty described by Helmont, most elective cosmetic surgery is still undertaken for aesthetic reasons. The popularity of these plastic surgeries has remained steady for several years. 2019 saw 28,000 aesthetic surgeries performed in the UK, of which nearly 3,000 were rhinoplasties, that is, nose jobs. At the experimental edges of surgical endeavor, though, ever more ambitious attempts are being made to restore and transform patients with facial differences. In 2020, for instance, New Yorker Joe DiMeo became the recipient of the world's first double hand and face transplant. DiMeo suffered 80% burns in a car accident, and his reconstructive surgery was hailed as a medical breakthrough. Though often life-saving, these radical surgeries can raise issues of identity, not dissimilar to those of the Renaissance nose job. The recipient of the world's first hand transplant, an Australian named Clint Holman, neglected the physical therapy and close medical supervision his doctors advised on the grounds that he did not identify with his new hand. He then stopped taking his immunosuppressant drug in order to force surgeons to remove the limb. As it began to be rejected, explained Hellman, I realized that it was not my hand after all. Now, borrowed faces? In the Renaissance, complete limb and face replacements like those performed by DeMeo or Hellman belonged in the realm of fantasy. Nonetheless, this period too had its surgical pioneers, and Tagliacozzi's famous nose reconstruction was at the cutting edge of medical science. The operation was first described by Tagliacozzi in 1596. He had probably learned it from an Italian family called the Brancas. In painstaking detail, Tagliacozzi outlined how a portion of the skin of the patient's arm first had to be lifted with forceps and cut on two sides before lint was placed underneath to prevent the skin reuniting with the flesh. When the swelling from the wound had died down, the surgeon was to cut the third edge of the skin flap, fold it back and bandage it, keeping the skin attached to the arm to maintain its blood supply. After 2 weeks or so, the surgeon could consider suturing the flap, still attached at one end to the arm, to the mutilated nose, binding the area with specially made bandages, and for the first week it was essential the patient avoided any movement, even talking, if the skin was to have a chance of adhering. 3 weeks later, one might fully detach the skin from the arm and continue reshaping the nose, but it would be a further 6 to 9 weeks before the nose could be finished, complete with nostrils. Now, in an era before antibiotics or anesthesia, the operation was dangerous and painful. Indeed, it's unclear if anyone other than Tagliacozzi ever attempted this procedure. Nonetheless, it captured the public imagination partly because it was so timely. In the 16th and 17th centuries saw an unprecedented need for facial surgery, driven by decades of war and rampant infectious diseases. Syphilis, or the French pox as it was known, was both the most commonplace and most shameful way to lose your nose. A serious infections caused the nasal cartilage to disintegrate. Typically, men picked up the venereal disease in brothels, took it home to their wives, and children might inherit it from their parents. There was also a social toll from syphilis, with vicious judgments passed on those with visible symptoms. In 1704, for example, the diarist Sarah Coper was told by her friend about a mutual acquaintance whose husband had given her the pox, and hearing that the afflicted woman was airy, brisk, and a great dancer, Coper retorted that by no means should any woman dance without a nose who never so innocently lost. For many years, people had attempted to hide their shame with false noses, often made of silver and enameled to look like real flesh. But Tagliacozzi's operation offered the chance of a real nose. No records exist to indicate how many nose operations Tagliacozzi performed, perhaps because he died at a young age of 49, just 2 years after publishing his famous work on the topic. Nonetheless, he claimed to be able to make noses so perfect that some patients found them better than the original ones which they had received from nature. Of course, this wasn't easy to achieve. Even in modern hand transplants, a new limb is never a perfect match for the recipient body. The skin will differ in color or texture, and the point of attachment is clearly visible. In the case of the 17th century nose job, Tagliacozzi admitted that by using skin from another part of the body, the grafted nose would differ in color and texture from the recipient's facial skin and might grow hair so luxuriant that it must be shaved. These differences led to allegations that, such as the one made by Van Helmont, that, contrary to Tagliacozzi's original instructions, rich patients were buying flesh from other people to make their new noses. Though there was no evidence for this, it was soon treated as fact, both by other physicians such as Van Helmont and by contemporary satirists. The English poet Hester Poulter wrote a jesting poem to her fellow royalist Sir William Devenant, offering to donate a piece of her leg to repair his missing nose, while the satirist Samuel Butler claimed that learned talicoteus from the brawny part of Porter's bum, cut supplemental noses which lasted as long as parent breech. But then the date of knock was out, off dropped the synthetic snout. So you can imagine. Now, rumors about borrowed noses also reflected growing public unease about the potential for cosmetics, prosthetics, and clothing to deceive onlookers. In the image-obsessed 1600s, fashion-conscious consumers could benefit from paddling to fatten the cheeks and hips, corsets to whittle the waist, lead washes to whiten the complexion, lead washes, rouge to redden the cheeks, and drops to brighten the eyes. More serious customers could even pay to have new teeth inserted, sometimes drawn from the mouths of corpses or servants. The diarist Samuel Pepys made it clear that he considered this to be deceitful. Pepys was peeved to find that he could not discern natural good looks from ones that had been paid for, but the stakes for nose operations were much higher. When a person's face could be repaired in such a radical way, how could one tell the genuinely healthy part from the merely wealthy? So, flesh, spirit, and sympathy. As the story of the Brussels man who lost his nose reveals, there was another more serious problem with the nose operation. Several sources allege that if a patient had their new nose made from flesh of another person, that nose could drop off when the donor died. It's as if the flesh knew that the donor had passed away, so it had to just do away with itself as well. In 1658, for instance, the scientist and courtier Sir Kenelm Digby asserted that artificial noses that are made of the flesh of other men do putrefy as soon as those persons out of whose substance they were taken come to die, as if that small parcel of flesh engrafted upon the face did live by the spirits it drew from its first root and source. He was probably thinking back to a story told by the physician's astrologer Robert Flood, who in 1631 related the story of a lord who had a new nose made from the flesh of a slave. All seemed well with the new nose, said Flood, until it happened that the slave fell sick and died, at which instant the lord's nose did gangrenate and rot. What can I tell you? Okay, this is a very long article, but I'll leave a link below for you for this. You can understand that what was going on, especially with, sword fighting and whatever. And, they had a lot of noses that were done away with at that time. Now, the donor of Joe DeMeo's new face and hands received replica parts supplied by New York University, LaGuardia 3D printing studio. DeMeo has gradually regained physical function, but the immunosuppressants he has to take for the rest of his life are a reminder that, in one sense at least, his transplants are still borrowed flesh. Like Van Helmon's nose-buying nobleman, 21st century transplant doctors and patients continue to grapple with the ethics and particularities of altering the body. Please leave your comments and thank you for your support.